My name's Alex Wilson. I'm the president of the Resilient Design Institute in Brattleboro, Vermont. Also founder of Building Green, an information and consulting company focused on green building that's been around since 1985. I guess that's enough for now. We'll get more into it later.
Lori?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lori Schumann. I am a native New Yorker. I'm an urban planner. I have been working in sustainability and resiliency and climate risk reduction, and as well as environmental justice and equity and building science for close to 20 years, both in California and in New York. I've been working on lots of interesting and unique projects across the country to try to promote and advance equity through the built environment. Really excited to be here. You may have at some time seen me in front of DOB with a donut in my hand and coffee trying to expedite permits. But tonight we're going to talk to you about the pain and agony of trying to get these buildings up and get this work done.
Thanks. And I'm Andy Pane, and later tonight I'm going to try to mediate everything and from everybody here. It's very funny now that Alex is on the call tonight. I'm not the oldest person here, and I'm not the one with the most years in the business, but I've been crawling through buildings for the last 40 years, and typically to make them more energy efficient, but along came Sandy, and I had to construction manage and plan and do a lot of work in literally thousands of multifamily units across Coney Island and Rockaway and the Lower East Side. So I've learned about resiliency and Sandy recovery the hard way. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex.
Great, thanks, Andy. And Andy's someone I've known for quite a while, a number of decades, and really value his, on the ground experience and his interest in, getting us all to talk about important issues. So I'm going to try sharing my screen. We'll see if that works. Okay. That's all about, but okay, can people see that?
I think you just have to stop your personal video.
Stop my personal.
I can see it.
I can see it, but your picture's in the corner of it for me. I guess
Yeah,
that's just me. Go ahead.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Yeah, it's fine. I can actually move you off the screen, so that works.
Okay. All right, so I'm trying to figure out my controls. It's really odd. Okay, well, so I'm going to talk about resilience and specifically focusing on power outages. This is one aspect of resilience. There are many. With Sandy, we saw a large swath of lower Manhattan without power, as well as areas scattered throughout, much of the broader city area. For some reason, I'm not able to advance my slides. I don't know what that's about. I'm going to have to escape the, this is, okay.
Harris, can you do the slides?
It's working now.
I'm not sure what was going on. So anyway, this just shows, the extent of the power outage that existed immediately following Sandy. Large numbers of people over 200,000 customers without power, the largest numbers in Lower Manhattan, but scattered throughout much of the area. Power outages aren't limited to New York City. We tend to focus on where we live, but in some areas it's been even worse. In California, there have been intentional power outages to deal with fire threat. We saw large areas of Pacific Gas and Electric's territory without power, being cut off intentionally. And then in Texas, we saw, significant portion of the state without power. And that's sort of a unforced error by Texas, where the state didn't want to be under federal regulations relative to power distribution. So they didn't want to join either the Eastern or Western power grid. So they've got their own power grid. And it meant that there wasn't an ability to pull power from either the Eastern or Western grid when they experienced the extreme winter weather, and their generators going down, their natural gas flows ceasing because they froze up. So that's sort of an arrogance problem that Texas has, but nonetheless, for the people of Texas, it was quite a hardship. So, when there's a power outage, there are all kinds of impacts, from being unable to fuel up our vehicles at gas stations that require power and don't have backup generators. But what I'm going to focus on is the life safety issues when we lose power. This brought this into focus in 2017 when in Hollywood, Florida, after Hurricane Irma, where a particular nursing home lost power and the backup generator didn't work. So it was big news. There were 14 residents of that nursing home that ended up dying in that event. And it really made us all look at the vulnerability in buildings when they lose power. So, this brings up the idea of passive survivability. And this was a concept that emerged in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. I was part of a design charrette that happened that fall, a month or so after Katrina happened, in Atlanta, where we brought a bunch of people up from the Gulf Coast, and I think there was up to 200 people preceding the Greenbuild conference that year in Atlanta to look at how to guide the reconstruction that was going to happen in the Gulf Coast and how to make it more sustainable. And like a lot of people with Katrina, we had followed on CNN the residents being evacuated to the Superdome. And then a day later, being evacuated from the Superdome because it was 110 degrees in there and 90% relative humidity. It wasn't a building designed to function without power, and lots of it. Similarly, in homes that weren't flooded, but nonetheless lost power for weeks and in some cases over a month, homes in the Gulf Coast, we observed that older homes did a lot better than newer homes. Homes built prior to the 1940s relied on what's often called vernacular architecture. That's design that makes sense for the bioclimate. So these were homes that had wraparound porches to shade the windows from direct sun. They were designed to channel summer breezes through the buildings. They often had high ceilings for temperature stratification, outdoor living areas. Anyway, those buildings did a lot better than newer homes that were built since air conditioning was introduced. And once we had air conditioning, we sort of forgot about designing for the climate and instead built the same house, whether it was in New Orleans or Boston, and fixed it with mechanical systems. So once those buildings lose power, those mechanical systems stop working, and the buildings get too hot in the summer or too cold in the winter. So with this design charrette in New Orleans that resulted in this publication, the New Orleans Principles, one of these 10 guiding principles that we came up with was to provide for passive survivability. And this was the idea that our homes, schools, and various public buildings should be designed so that they maintain habitable conditions for people in the event of loss of power, interruptions in heating fuel, etc. And I got pretty excited about that idea because I saw it as a motivation to build more sustainable homes and commercial buildings. And I'd been at this point advancing green building for several decades. And I saw this a way to sort of enlarge the tent, bring more people into green building from a life safety standpoint. So the idea with passive survivability is illustrated in these several graphs. This shows different home building types in New York City. This was energy modeling that was done by Atelier 10 following Superstorm Sandy. And it shows what happens in these different types of buildings with a week-long power outage in the winter. So you can see these different buildings, the temperature dropping over that 7-day period, and pretty quickly the temperatures in most of these building types drop below a level where it's safe, below about 50 degrees. People are, at risk of hypothermia and can die from exposure. So, these are buildings at current building stock before Andy Pane has gotten to them to advocate for energy improvements. So this is standard building stock. If we instead look at buildings built to the model energy code, these graphs are, drop off a lot more slowly. And they basically are keeping temperatures at a temperature level where if you bundle up in a coat or get in a sleeping bag, you're not going to die. You're not going to, in most cases, develop hypothermia. So, this argues for energy efficiency, and it was, my motivation for getting involved with resilience. We can look at the same types of charts in a summer situation, a week-long period in the summer when power is lost. And again, these are typical buildings in today's building stock. You can see that the worst performer is the all-glass high-rise building, where within a matter of hours, it can reach temperatures that cause risk of hypothermia. Heat stroke, getting too hot and putting people at risk. And again, we can look at this similar graphs with buildings built to model energy codes, where these, there's still this daily fluctuation, but the fluctuation is far less extreme. And in most cases, it's kept at a temperature where, you're not at risk of heat stroke. Okay, so that's the basic concept of passive survivability. Now, New York City, we're here to talk about New York City. Despite the problems that I think Andy and Lori will talk about in terms of response to disturbance, New York City has really been a national leader in addressing at least this issue. Back in 2010, a couple of years before Sandy, there was an initiative, a Greening the Codes task force that was put together, organized by the Urban Green Council. And I was part of that committee, and I was there advocating for addressing passive survivability in New York. You know, I've been particularly worried about New York City with the all glass skyscrapers going up all the time, these condo buildings that, you know, are going to become uninhabitable within hours after losing power. So, you know, I advocated for that. It did get incorporated into the task force report, kind of a weak solution. You know, they argued for, you know, researching this topic, but at least it was mentioned and, you know, gained some exposure citywide. Then shortly thereafter, a couple of years later, Sandy happened, and another task force was put together by the Urban Green Council at the request of Mayor Bloomberg and Speaker Quinn. And I was also part of that task force, the Building Resiliency Task Force. And one of the 33 recommendations that came out of that task force was this one: to maintain habitable temperatures without power. And, you know, I was really excited that, you know, this made it to the, you know, that cut of recommended action items. You know, I wish I could report that that's been implemented now in building codes or incentives or, you know, other regulatory mechanisms, but at least it's out there. And my hope is that with the next disaster where there's a significant power outage during either a peak summer cooling period or a peak winter heating period, you know, that the city will take action and implement this recommendation, you know, but at least it's out there. So the strategies for achieving passive survivability are, you know, all of the things that people like Andy and the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association and Lori and I have been advocating for decades. You know, it's basically smart design, high levels of insulation, airtight construction, high performance glazings, relying on passive solar design, orienting buildings properly, smartly, incorporating thermal mass in buildings, providing natural ventilation and daylighting. A big part of it, particularly in bigger buildings, is about cooling load avoidance. You know, orientation is part of that, reducing glass, particularly on east and west facades, overhangs and other forms of shading, spectrally selective glazings, exterior window treatments, reflective roofs, you know, all of these aspects of smart design. And, you know, all of them can help keep people safe, but very significantly, they also save energy and money all the time for the building owners or the occupants of those apartments. You know, this benefit is illustrated in this thermographic image, which I love, showing a streetscape in Brooklyn. It's a thermograph, so the reds and yellows indicate more heat loss from the buildings. And that one in the center is a Passive House certified brownstone where, you know, there's almost no heat loss showing. It's mostly blue. So, you know, this concept of passive survivability, we've addressed it in some pilot credits in the LEED rating system, pilot credits that address this. To do that, we had to come up with a methodology for measuring whether a building will maintain safe conditions and even the metrics for doing so. I won't get into that, but you know, at least that's put some ideas on the table for discussion. And then just recently, this is very current, the Department of Energy is finally addressing this. There's a working group that's examining this issue and developing much more in-depth modeling of energy performance, and you know, with the idea of developing code language so that passive survivability could be incorporated into building codes. So with that, I'll turn things back to Lori, just mentioning the Resilient Design Institute website. We've got lots of information available there at resilientdesign.org. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Lori.
Thank you, Andy. Can everyone hear me okay? Andy,
Yes.
okay, good. Well, it's great to be among everyone, and I'm going to go through kind of a journey of where we've come from in the last decade or so in terms of the work that Enterprise has been doing in New York around this theme of resiliency. And what I'm going to do right now is share my screen, and just let me know if you can just bear with me. Okay, can you guys see my screen? I'm getting a thumbs up from Alex. Okay. So Enterprise Community Partners has been working in affordable housing for close to 40 years. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. The organization was founded by Jim Rouse, who actually was the developer of the South Street Seaport. Fun fact. My organization was developed to respond to the crisis of affordable housing needs in the United States. At the time, he was in Baltimore and decided that we needed to build more affordable housing for a variety of reasons. Fast forward to today, the needs for affordable housing are ever more severe. And one of the themes you'll find as I speak is without sufficient affordable housing, there can be no resiliency in our communities. And without safe and resilient affordable housing, there can be no housing in our communities. Our three goals are really to preserve and protect good homes that people can afford, also to advance racial equity, because we know that that racial inequity and all of the various and very severe challenges that communities of color face across the United States are ever present. And certainly the climate crisis shows up in a very significant way for communities of color. So we are addressing that. And we're also addressing climate resiliency and building upward mobility. And so the work I'm going to talk about today is part of that. And I have to say, I'm proud that the work we've been doing over the last decade has helped to support and strengthen our commitment to this work at a national scale. And my specific role is I work in the capital section of our organization on financing climate risk reduction. So I'm going to start by saying that the housing affordability crisis is with us, displacing millions of Americans every night. Someone's sleeping on the street. And at the same time, COVID has reminded us that housing is not just a place to live. It is a place we work, we learn, we gather. Housing has been transformed by the COVID crisis. And so it is ever more important, and we use this in our advocacy, that we must build more affordable housing and that housing must be resilient. And when I talk about affordable housing today, I'm going to talk about multifamily housing. This is the housing that many of us live in. And please feel free to use the chat and chime in with questions or even comments as I keep going forward. Enterprise works with a variety of partners across the nation, from public sector, federal, state, and local, to private sector, banks, investment vehicles, organizations, agencies. We have been working on this topic and many of the topics I just mentioned for so many years. And Enterprise is really an intermediary. What that means is we respond to issues of the day, and we respond and often find ourselves collaborating and intervening between different stakeholders, which is why I love my job, because I get to have and wear many different hats with lots of different languages. It's no surprise to anyone on this call that disasters have grown even more severe and more significant. You know, I track everything in the climate space and the evolution of how we're moving forward with climate risk and the cost of it with the evolution of communities. Like I said, I'm an urban planner. As we see the growth of MSAs or metropolitan regions and the growth of cities, many of which are on disaster in disaster prone areas, floodplains on the coast, earthquake zones, right? Los Angeles, 5th largest economy in the world, is in the middle of potentially a big one. So we see the rise of cities coupled with the cost of climate events. The cost of climate events are profoundly more expensive because you have more density. And so this is something that is ever with us and is all the more reason why we need to be concentrating on the issues of housing and preservation. And climate risk is showing up in our communities in so many ways. It is eroding our existing affordable housing, not getting replaced very quickly. There's always a fight when you have to build affordable housing. It displaces households. Many of those households are communities of color that have been living in communities that are at risk, partly because those communities were deemed less valuable, right? Land use. In New York City, there was a time when you just didn't, more affluent households didn't move to the coastline, and that's where our public housing was moved. And now there's a reverse. Well, this is displacing a lot of households, and this is not the time for this conversation, but I am interested in hearing about everyone's perception and understanding of climate migration. It impacts workforce and economy, it impacts utilities, and it impacts our ability to stay consistent and maintain our institutions and schools. So Hurricane Sandy 10 years ago was one of the most critical moments in my lifetime in New York City. It was a bellwether moment for our community of climate practitioners because it really showed the world that, yes, even New York City is not too big to fail. And we failed hard. We lost a lot of affordable housing that still is not replaced. We lost a lot of infrastructure. We lost a lot of our commerce. We lost a lot of our story, but a new story began. And this is a story of how do we support and maintain our affordable housing and our infrastructure and our cities and protect our cities amidst this crisis. We got the largest settlement of CDBGDR or appropriation of CDBGDR funding in the nation's history. We got $50 billion. Some of that money is still funding a lot of programs today.
Lori, please tell people what CDBGDR is.
Absolutely, Andy. Community Development Block Grant funding is a stable of funding that is allocated to communities across the nation for bread and butter services, social services, institutional services, et cetera. There's a special allocation of Community Development Block Grant that happens after a disaster is declared by the president. Congress allocates what's called CDBGDR or disaster recovery allocation. You all should know about this because it's the primary source of funding for disaster recovery. We're going to talk later with Andy about, is it actually disaster recovery funding, right? Because it doesn't come forward that quickly, but we'll get into that later. So this funding was really critical to help us figure out how to rebuild. My colleague, Bomi Jung, who was one of the co-founders of Green Home, was a mastermind behind one of the design competitions called Far Rock. And this actually led to the national Rebuild by Design competition. So Enterprise responded with really innovative ideas like this idea. We also responded with a really robust program. And this is when I came to the organization. We worked with 12 developers of affordable housing across the region that owned and operated 15,000 units of affordable housing. And what we did is we developed and deployed grant funding. We did everything from hire people like our Andy and I have a good colleague, Henry Gifford, hiring him to go out and fix boilers across the city, or hiring folks to deal with immediate urgent needs. So when I came into the organization and the program, I have a strong background in construction and planning, and I love buildings and I love everything about buildings. And so one of the first things we did is we said we need to assess what's going on in the buildings and the building stock that we're working with in the housing owners that we're supporting. You'll excuse my spelling of the resiliency. Perhaps that's a subliminal message there, but the first thing we said is we need to figure out how to assess buildings for risk. And my dear friend Tom Sahajian, who may be on this call, and I sat down and worked through what we ultimately called a resiliency capital needs assessment. And we hired 4 teams of engineers to go out across the region and take that resiliency capital needs assessment and assess and analyze buildings. We got to about 200 buildings, small walk-ups, public housing, senior, you name it. And what we came up with was a resiliency needs assessment that we were really proud of. We worked with the Housing Preservation and Development team in New York City and provided that to them. And then they adapted that for their program, which was funded by DR funds. And then this became a tool that was used by the city of New York to shape how to think about resiliency assessment. I'm really proud of that because we were sort of just throwing spaghetti at the wall in a sense. We knew a lot about buildings, we knew a lot about climate risk, but we really wanted to make sure that it worked for the field. And we had 200 buildings assessed, and we came up with 200 and something reports of every kind of building possible. We went inside the buildings, from basements to roof to perimeter to units, and we figured out what the climate risks were. And together we were able to come up with some really great stuff. But one of the things we kept asking ourselves was, what do we do to these buildings? How do we fix these buildings? And we kept looking at the FEMA guidance, and it kept saying elevate, elevate, elevate. That's not possible. If anyone's been in a stout multifamily building, you're not going to elevate these buildings in place. The only building you can actually elevate is a new construction. It's not worth elevating an existing housing facility. And we'll talk about that. So what we ended up doing is saying, how do we come up with some guidance? And so we came up with some guidance over the term. And then one day I went down to, Alex will remember this, we went up to Boston to the NYC conference, and we gathered and we said, look, what are the solutions for multifamily buildings for resiliency? We don't really have anything to show the marketplace for what we mean by resiliency. And Alex will remember this. We huddled together and we came up with an idea to develop this: strategies for multifamily housing resiliency. We took all the reports we created. We took, Alex, I think it was about 70 or so people that we gathered together with Jim Newman and Mark Ginsberg, and we came up with this book. Samantha Yost is a big active member of the Green Home community. She was a critical part of making this come to life, as well as Tom Sahajian. And this book essentially outlines what we mean by multifamily resiliency. This book has led to over $300 million worth of investment in affordable housing across the nation. It led to the development of a FEMA catalog on multifamily housing. It's been a really important tool, and we're digitizing it. It's going to go live next month, so stay tuned. But this is an issue that was important in 2013, and it's ever more important today, because when we talk about affordable housing and multifamily housing, we're talking about workforce housing, renter housing, housing that supports the most vulnerable communities, and it is housing that is New York City's finest. This is housing that is so critical to the future of New York City. So we want to get this right. Then we took the book down to Puerto Rico after Maria, and they said, we want to do something for housing in Puerto Rico. So we created the Keep Safe book, which is a sort of single family version of the multifamily book. And this takes you through the sequence of what we mean by building in a resilient fashion. This was actually my dream book, because I love the sequence of housing and how you figure out how to use your site, how do you move through the building, the bones, the habitability. We call it habitability, not survivability. But they're both very important terms. And then energy, water, and preparedness. So these twin books are really critical for single family. And then we moved forward and we said, hey, we need to figure out which of the buildings that you're working on or you own or operate needs to be attended to. So we've created an app called Portfolio Protect, which helps you understand which housing should I prioritize in my portfolio to protect for climate risk. And it essentially rates your building based on your social vulnerability coupled with your climate score. And then we went further to say, look, building is only resilient as its operators and as its plan. So we need a plan, we need a business continuity plan. And so those developers that I talked about helped inform this. So Andy will remember this photo. This is one of my favorite photos in the world. And Andy can explain it later, but I just want to say, and I'm going to be wrapping this up, you know, we talk about this stuff, we talk about the theory, it only means anything until it's built. You know, we can talk all day about ideas, but I want to see these ideas built out. And Andy was able to get this project, which I hope we'll talk about, off the ground. This was one of the most challenging projects in our country. This is a boiler, one of the most famous boilers, I think, around. It's on the rooftop of a tenement in New York City. And I'll save this for Andy, but this is a magnificent project, which the New York Times covered, and this was on the front of the New York Times. So how can we go from this to that? What are the techniques to make housing, multifamily housing, resilient? What did we learn in Ida? We learned that extreme precipitation is our immediate risk. It's not just surge. We've learned that it's not just the buildings that have to be resilient, but our storm and sewers need to be resilient. Our infrastructure needs resiliency. We need to figure out how to finance this stuff. And we also need to build affordable housing so that people don't have to go to basement apartments to live, because all of those folks that died during Ida in the basement apartments were there because it's affordable housing and there's not a lot of it. And living under the basement means you're living under what's called the base flood elevation. And that is not sustainable in a world that's increasingly flooding. And as we see more flooding happening, we're going to see the loss and erosion of affordable housing. And we're also going to see the loss of lives and homes that are destroyed and generational wealth that is never recaptured. I'm happy to say next week we're opening up Keep Safe Miami or Keep Safe Florida, which is a build out of all the work that we've done in New York City. And I'll just close this with a call to action, which is we need a resiliency standard for housing, which with a focus on flood. We need to build more affordable housing and embed these principles in our affordable housing. And we need to identify financing to close the gap between building for today and building for tomorrow. Thank you so much. Turning over to Andy.
Well, there's two of my favorite people chatting for a while. That's always good. I have some questions for both of you. And I guess I'm going to get up on my soapbox for a minute, of course, because I'm required by law to do that. But it seems to me that when I started working in resilience, in Sandy, in CD, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery money, after a while, I figured out that the CDBG money actually comes from Homeland Security. Then it's given to FEMA. Then FEMA gives it to HUD. HUD gave it to New York City. For housing, New York City gave it to HPD. HPD hired 3 separate, what they call sub-recipients, to actually dole the money out because they didn't think they could do it efficiently enough. Those 3 different recipients had to have 3 separate engineering reviews, a construction manager for the job before the bids went out and before any work started. And the work was all prevailing wage. And I get prevailing wage, and I'm not against people getting paid their fair share. But in Sandy, electricians were being paid over $175 an hour, which is quite a prevailing wage. So although that I feel that Sandy educated a lot of contractors because they had to do work that met code, that had the right insulation levels. The contractors learned stuff from Sandy, did the federal government learn anything from the contractors about how, my personal feeling is that CDBGDR was sort of figured out for rural areas, and it wasn't ready for cities like New York. So I'll toss that to either and both of you. Have these regulations changed at all? And has the government figured out how hard it is to spend CDBG money?
I'm happy to respond, Alex, unless,
Please.
okay.
Coward.
So here's the thing. I mean, what you've laid out is a nightmare, Andy. It's a maze of rooms, and each room leads to another room, and it's a very complicated program. And it's partly complicated because there's a feeling that if it's not complicated, people are going to rip off the government. So you need a lot of administration to prevent that from happening. But that is not the real answer. The issue right now is this: the program is not a standing program. In other words, it's not a permanently authorized program. So every single time there's a disaster and there's a new allocation, the rules have to be started up again. And there's no permanent way of saying, we're going to deal with this particular issue or this challenge and write it into the program and move forward in a more effective way. It's a program that gets stood up much like a temporary house every single time there's an event. So there's a push to authorize it permanently. And that's been on the floor, the Senate floor, for multiple administrations. And one of the reasons why it needs to be permanently authorized is the staff at HUD that are administering this program can't hire permanent staff. They're hamstrung because it is something that's a temporary program. Is there a way to engage the staff at HUD around the challenges of the program? There should be, and the staff are open to hearing about ways of making it more efficient. But like a lot of federal programs, you have to get through some due diligence in order to get the work done. But the program has to, it has to be eased up on the administrative burden because it's very difficult to get this funding out. The best hope we have at this moment is to have this program become permanently authorized so we can start building some capacity. I mean, I'll just say the last thing. The Community Development Block Grant, which goes to 3,300 communities across the country, you've got people that have been running this for decades and they know how to make it work. They know how to jump through hoops and quicken the administration of it. That's where we want to get with the DR funding.
But they don't understand things, and I'll give one perfect example. Much of the DR funding for housing is a 0%, 100% forgivable loan to building owners. But the typical building owner that this addresses is a single family home. And if a single family homeowner has lost half of their house and they're not paying their mortgage, and they go to their bank and they say, hey, I just got this, 100% forgivable loan, the banker says, take it. In a multifamily building, the loan officer looks at this, talking to a multifamily building owner, and they say, wait a second, this is a loan from the federal government. So my loan suddenly takes second position and I won't get my money back. So they refuse to let the owner accept this money. It was only, and I'll tell the absolute truth, an under 30-year-old loan officer from CPC who was really smart wrote a document that explained this to HPD and CDBGDR and the owners and the banks signed off on it because someone who had a very, very good education in this simplified the loan package, and the banker said, oh, that's what it is? Okay, we approve it. So this whole thing tied around single family homes is just really ridiculous.
I'll say before turning to Alex, I just want to say after doing this work for all these years, I mean, I think that there's an argument to be said for having the Army Corps take care of a lot of this rebuilding and just have a lot of this funding moved into an agency that knows how to use this funding and can do it on behalf of communities, because it's so hard, right?
Not entirely sure I want to put the Army in charge, but anyway, Alex, I have a question for you about passive survivability, and I witnessed it many years ago in upstate New York in the Adirondacks, where we had a late snowfall and literally every single telephone pole in upstate New York snapped, literally snapped. And people had no power in upstate New York, some of them for 6 weeks. And I see the power go out in Tornado Alley, and I see the power go out in Florida. And I lived in New York City during Sandy, and my power never went out because I live in Manhattan and the power lines are underground. When are people going to start putting all the power lines underground as part of passive survivability and not passing along the replacement of power lines to the ratepayers once every 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, you know, that's a really important solution to this, burying power lines. And a number of years ago, I went over to Sweden for a couple of weeks and was staying in the city of Lund and heard a really interesting story about Lund, where back in the, I don't know, it might have been the 1980s or 1990s, there was a really significant winter storm that did as you just described, you know, knocked out power for weeks. And what the city did was decide to bury all of the power lines throughout the city. Not only that, but they thought, well, as long as we're burying the power lines and creating these corridors of, you know, buried conduit, let's do something else with those corridors. So they built a network of bicycle paths throughout the city on top of these corridors, where not only they had the power buried, but also data, sewer, water, and district heat. You know, now that's kind of, it's a lot easier to do in a social democracy like Sweden, where taxes are high, but so are services. And, you know, one can argue that that's impossible in the US because there's not one entity that owns all of those things. You know, in Sweden, the government owns the power, the sewer, the data, the water, you know, all of these things, and they can put those all together and bury them. But anyway, so in answer to your question, I think burying power in suburban and even rural areas makes a whole lot of sense. And, you know, why they haven't done that in California is beyond me. You know, when we look at these, you know, year after year wildfires that are, you know, taking out above ground power and causing utility companies to proactively cut power, you know, it seems like a no-brainer. Not inexpensive, but those lawsuits aren't inexpensive either.
I think that's actually going to end up with the demise of Pacific Gas and Electric, and probably have it end up being some sort of municipal utility. Or, but you know, someone just said in the chat that power in Lower Manhattan went out. Power went out in a lot of places in Manhattan, but it didn't go out in a lot of places in the city because of buried power lines. And if we didn't have those buried power lines, the whole city would have gone out. So we're asking that anybody have questions, drop it into the chat, or else Lori and Alex and I will just go on for.
Well, Andy, I'd like to point out a couple things. I agree about the buried power lines. I mean, the expense is enormous. It's something like, it's something in the order of, you know, $1 million per 10 feet, I've heard, of burying power lines in Manhattan. So it's an issue, but it's also a big issue for communities of color and what we call frontline communities that are living on the edges of our coasts, in communities that have been redlined, and they have not been receiving the benefits that communities in Upper Manhattan may have. So if you go out to the Rockaways, you see a lot of lines that are above ground. I will say that we have an opportunity with the new funding coming in for infrastructure. I hope the good folks in our city will think about how to deal with our electrical grid utilizing this funding in a way that's going to give us more resiliency. I think this is a call to action for Green Home to really track and make sure that that's happening, because this funding doesn't come very forward that much. And we also have some incredible leadership at the Public Services Commission under the leadership of Rory Christian that is, you know, looking for solutions to help build our resiliency. So I think there's some opportunity here.
Speaking of power, it's really curious, you know, looking at current events and Ukraine. I was on a webinar maybe a month ago about the power grid in Ukraine. And I had been watching news coverage of the Russian invasion and seeing, you know, these buildings that are bombed with the power still on. And I'm saying, how is that possible that they've still got power to these locations? Well, it turns out that Ukraine's power grid was, and I guess I have to say this past tense, way more advanced than the US power grid. And they were able to, you know, within minutes of the invasion, switch over to interconnect with the Western Europe power grid, to disconnect from the Russian power grid. They had all these interconnections so that if, you know, one power plant went down or a distribution line went down, they could reroute the power around it. I was blown away. You know, I kind of thought, you know, Ukraine was, you know, just way behind where we are, but they were actually ahead of us.
Alex, I actually have a question in regards to when you spoke about the habitable temperatures without power and the task force that was extended through the fall of 2013. I believe you alluded to how they aren't doing anything or not acting as they should be. Correct me if I'm wrong. In your opinion, and of course you too, Lori, how do we get task forces to actually do what they're supposed to be doing? Or if in an ideal situation, what would you ask of the money flow, of the government, of the leadership to do to really make our task forces effective with resiliency?
Well, the Building Resiliency Task Force and the Greening the Codes Task Force a couple years before that were really advisory task forces. You know, they weren't designed to implement change. They were to identify what the opportunities were. It's really up to the city government to institute building codes and other regulatory mechanisms to accomplish this. And, you know, just when COVID broke out, I was in some discussions with the city council, city hall, about, you know, beginning to look into code language, and the person that I was working with left and that kind of dropped off the table. But, you know, I think that time is ripe to, you know, convince the building code bodies. And, you know, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I don't know enough about the inner workings of the city of New York to know where those leverage points are. But, you know, there's a need for incorporating thermal habitability, or whatever we want to call it, into building codes. And it becomes a, you know, a motivation to create the energy performance that we need for other reasons, you know, to keep our buildings more affordable to operate, to accomplish our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, all of these other goals that exist, and to, address the disadvantaged communities.
Mhm. Thanks, Alex.
I think that's a good point, Alex, because a lot of times task forces are put together during some sort of crisis. And
Mhm.
so because of that, they have to react to something. And the Greening the Code task force worked a lot more efficiently because a lot of the things that were coming into the new codes in the city 10, 15 years ago couldn't be achieved because the buildings weren't allowed to put exterior insulation on in certain areas. They weren't allowed to, there were many things in the code that were institutional barriers to energy efficiency. And a lot of those have been cleaned up. But one of the ones that Lori touched on basically is moving the boiler to the roof of the building. And Henry Gifford and Chris Benedict did this years ago, and they fought City Hall left and right to move the boiler to the roof. But in fact, in moving the boiler to the roof, they significantly reduced the on and off cycle losses of the boiler because the boiler didn't have a 65-foot chimney that was sucking heat out of the boiler all the time. That's a really, really important thing, that not only moving the boiler keeps it resilient during a flood and all of the mechanical equipment is up there, but in the building you're talking about, Lori, we went to the Public Service Commission and said, these people are sub-metered by Con Edison, but we want to sub-meter them electronically, because if we do that, then we can bring a Con Ed master meter, and then we can put solar on the roof, and we can put a combined heat and power boiler on the roof, so that in the case of another Sandy type problem in this building, we would have the solar power and the combined heat and power to ignite the boiler, keep the boilers running, give power to a good part of the building, and still give the building hot water.
Yeah.
And the most difficult part about that was filing to the Public Service Commission and telling them the low-income residents in this building want to switch from this type of metering to this type of metering. And I did the filing, and it was 131 pages submitted to the Public Service Commission 3 separate times.
Oh my gosh.
And as I have said to the Public Service Commission and NYSERDA many times over the last few years, this can't be a legal document. It has to be a checklist that says, click, 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 click. We want to do this. We agree, we agree, we agree.
But
because I'm dealing with 5,000 units of multifamily housing right now that are master metered for electricity. And all of the managers fully believe that the city and state do not allow them to sub-meter. And that's frightening.
Well, it raises a great point, though, on a broader level, that we can use disturbances, disruptions, whatever the crisis is, as opportunities to end up with something better. And I like to talk about, rather than bouncing back, bouncing forward. And, yes, there's red tape, but when we elevate the mechanical equipment, we can deal with these losses. We can upgrade to, maybe it's air source heat pumps, maybe it's other technologies that are higher efficiency. We can use these disasters as opportunities to improve. And, I always like to look at the bright side, and leave it to other people to deal with the red tape.
Well, I think that the folks like you, Andy and Alex, that are doing the hard work to lift up these solutions as first in class are setting us up for more of the same kind. I'll give you a story. I was in San Francisco building the first off-grid environmental education center in the city, meaning all of its water, wastewater, energy, everything was generated and treated on site and reused on site. And this building, it still stands today. It's working beautifully. And we developed the first on-site wastewater treatment system in the city. And it took me 5 years to get that permitted on Port of San Francisco land. Every single day I worked on this permit, and it took me going all the way up to the state and back. Anyway, long story short, fast forward 10 years, now the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has an on-site wastewater treatment system within its headquarters in San Francisco. Why did they get that permitted? Because we were able to set the precedent.
Yeah.
Inspectors want to see precedent. I mean, Andy, what you did sets a precedent, and folks don't want to lose their jobs. They get comfortable when their peers do it. So for any of you wanting to innovate, you know, it's going to be hard on the first go, but it's going to set you up for being able to make the argument. It works here, it can work there. I mean, I live and die by that.
Yeah, and you know, with New York City, you know, while I'm disappointed that the passive habitability recommendation from that building resiliency task force hasn't been implemented, I think it's really positive and was surprising to me that of the 33 recommendations that came out of that task force, over half of them now have been implemented. You know, and that happened within 2 or 3 years after Sandy, which you know, I think was just extraordinary for bureaucracies of that complexity, you know, to change building codes, to change the regulatory structures, to allow for things like that.
We do have a Catherine Hughes who asked, are we working with heat pumps at all? Are there any projects that we've done in the past with heat pumps?
I think it's fair to say that we are forced to install heat pumps in a lot of installations now because everyone wants electrification. I am also concerned about Alex's earlier comment that when we do efficiency and when we do sustainability in the building, we make a building more resilient in a bad situation, whatever that situation may be. I heard a very high-ranking person in the city government, when I asked about efficiency in buildings, say, I don't want to hear about efficiency, I just want to hear about electrification. And efficiency is the very best decarbonization, you know, strategy I can think of. But I'm going to try to stay on Sandy recovery things. So
well, most of those people are going to be retiring in a few years.
And the other thing is, Andy, as you pointed out before, federal funding has to have authorization to fund certain things. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that the feds understand what are the best practices, and that they allocate funding towards that and help set up an ease of implementation that is going to help us deploy the funding. I mean, funding right now is going out for shovel-ready projects. We need to help define what shovel-ready means right now so that we can get the funding we need to do the work we need to do.
We have a Sam Jackson who asked the following. Do the panelists believe that we need to take regional measures along with building specific measures in order to protect the entire New York City region from storm surge? He mentions also that New Orleans built their Great Wall of Louisiana after Katrina, and it was effective during Ida. They built it in 4.5 years. Currently, the Army Corps of Engineering is considering this option for New York City in the harbor and tributaries study, although they are greatly overestimating the timing and cost of such a project. ... Thoughts?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that, and then I'll let my colleagues answer it more responsibly. You know, it's a big challenge on many levels. You know, I think that in a place like Manhattan and New York City more generally, there's so much value in real estate that there's some, you know, justification to spend tens of billions of dollars to protect that by, building levees or seawalls or, big, expensive infrastructure efforts. But when you do that, you exacerbate the problem elsewhere. If the floodwaters can't come into Manhattan, they're going to go into Staten Island or, other parts of New Jersey and Connecticut. So, we need to take that into effect. And, at some point down the road when, enough of the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica have melted, we're going to be looking at, sort of a measured retreat from some coastal areas. And, it may be that, New York City is valuable enough that it's, society deems it worthwhile to spend that money to protect it, but that would mean sacrificing other coastal areas. So it's a really complicated issue, and I certainly don't have the answers, but I can guarantee that it's going to be a heated debate that's going to last for many years before something's actually implemented.
I saw a question a minute ago in the chat that someone asked about double pane versus triple pane windows, and it brings me to a discussion I had at the National Affordable Comfort Conference last week, where someone from the National Labs stood up and said, we have to do all these things in buildings, and we just have to spend the money, and we can't think about ROI, return on investment, and we can't think about payback. And I found it very humorous that this person clearly had never talked to a building owner who's actually working with a non-infinite amount of money, and they need they only have so much money to spend in a building. I would love to see, this person just asked more about triple pane windows. I'd love to see triple pane windows in buildings. I'd love to see owners in New York City, particularly in multifamily, doing fiberglass instead of aluminum windows. They perform so much better, and the noise reduction is fantastic. But the cost is dramatically more expensive. And owners pick, one of the smartest owners I dealt with said to me many years ago, what's the break-even point where I can, if we're going to insulate between the concrete and the metal studs in the building, what's the least amount of insulation I can put in there to reduce thermal bridging the most effectively, to make the insulation work more effectively? And so it's always a nickel and dime thing in buildings. And I'm working on a complex in the Bronx that is a low-rise condo, low-income building that has been around since the mid-1980s, and they need a big retrofit. And it's one of the few buildings where we really see the cost effectiveness of electrification for the building, but the additional infrastructure work we'd have to do in the building, neither the building nor any of the government programs can pay for it.
There are times when one can economically justify going to the expense of something like triple glazed windows because of reduced costs elsewhere. And I love the example. There's a hospital in Boston, Spalding Rehab Hospital, a spinal cord injury hospital. And Perkins and Will, the designers of that building, were just beginning design of that when Katrina hit in the Gulf Coast. And they saw the Veterans Hospital there with sealed buildings, lost power, patient rooms were 105, 110 degrees, and nursing staff were using chairs to break windows to try to get fresh air into the patient rooms to keep patients alive that they weren't able to evacuate. A lot of people died in that. So Perkins and Will, in designing Spalding Rehab, took that to heart and created a building that has a really well insulated envelope. They use triple glazing throughout. The spandrel glazing is really well insulated. They've got shading systems throughout to keep out unwanted sun. They have operable windows in every patient room, as well as in really all common spaces in the building. I think it's the first modern hospital with operable windows. Plus they did all the flood proofing stuff because it's right on Boston Harbor. All the mechanicals are on the roof or in one of the 2 penthouse floors. Backup generators are up there. They had the utility company brought the high voltage power up to the roof. They had to build a concrete chase to get that high voltage power up to the roof. And there's a utility building on the roof. Anyway, it's a great case study of resilience. But the issue of triple glazing, they justified that cost by being able to eliminate the perimeter heating systems, because the energy performance was modeled to be good enough that they no longer needed, continuous perimeter heat and cooling diffusers. So, there are ways to tunnel through that cost curve, as Amory Lovins used to talk about.
It's very funny, Alex. I dealt with a condo building in Rockaway, and they were literally, their ground floor was all parking, and it worked very effectively for Sandy because no damage was done to the rest of the building. Unfortunately, they had very, very weak, cheap fiberglass garage doors. And so the ocean came and crashed through the front garage door and bashed through the rear garage door, and the cars just all went into the bay. The building was saved, but they lost a lot of cars in the deal. So
but they could have driven those cars out in advance of the storm, and that's what that solution calls for. And those garage doors should have been left open. The cars should have been taken out and parked up in outside
in Andy's neighborhood.
Right, but unfortunately, these people are also 2 blocks from the subway, so they didn't really need a car. But anyway, that's another thing that we won't get into tonight.
Well, Andy, I want to just point out something you said that's really important is, we have to think about how to finance this work. And I think that in order to finance this work, we need to absolutely focus on the return on investment. But I think we need to also monetize or quantify what the benefits are. What will the benefits bring us? So Alex, for your example about the windows, what does increased ventilation do for an occupant? I mean, let's quantify that in reduced costs of going to the hospital or reduced asthma. I mean, one of the things I'd love to see in our industry is a way to actually identify all of the multiple benefits that come out of our resiliency upgrades and fold those into the ROI. So it's not your traditional, just your energy savings, but that we can see there's actually a cost of having a community space that, translates into better connectivity among residents, that could translate into, training opportunities. Maybe there's a way to figure out how to support health, right? And other benefits. I mean, is there a return on investment for happiness or stability of housing? Yeah. I think that's what we need to get to, because financing institutions are looking at metrics. They're looking closely. One thing I think we should be riding the wave of is the increased focus on ESG, environmental social governance in the financial industry. A lot of banks and financial institutions are looking to make ESG investments. I would make the argument that investing in climate risk reduction is solidly in the ESG space. So I see a lot of opportunity for us in the next decade.
I would just like to see someone spend a lot of time educating loan officers, because every time a building refinances their debt, they don't look at resilience, they don't look at energy efficiency, They don't look at alternative energy. They just look at, maybe we should put new lights in the lobby. Maybe we should, I mean, they do stuff to make the house pretty, or let's put a new kitchen in, you know, if it's a single family house. But nobody says, let's move the HVAC system up a floor. Let's, you know, let's do a lot of things. Let's upgrade the exterior insulation. And when I see buildings that are 4 years old and have these massive flaws in them that Alex and I saw in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we're continuing to build bad housing, and we're continuing not to rehabilitate to make housing better. And I think that I'm going to be speaking at the ACEEE Financing Energy Efficiency seminar next month, and I doubt there's going to be a building owner there.
Mhm.
It's going to be, you know, bankers talking to government officials, and they're all going to agree. But I don't think that anybody there is going to be able to explain to an owner, this is why we want to do this package of stuff.
So
And
Andy,
I did it.
yeah.
Go ahead,
Andy,
Alex.
do you think it's different in commercial real estate, you know, particularly in New York City? You know, I think one of the big surprises coming out of Sandy was just how significant the insurance claims were on business interruption. And, you know, that was a wake-up call to the insurance industry. And, you know, I have to imagine that, you know, they're thinking pretty hard about how they can encourage building owners or incentivize building owners to become more resilient so that they're not having to, you know, pay, you know, these business interruption claims, or they're jacking up the cost of insurance to sort of force the building owners to do that.
They're significantly jacking up the cost of insurance,
But that's got to be motivating the building owners, not in housing, but in commercial real estate.
Yeah, in housing, they're kind of stuck, you know, and particularly, and in all of these discussions, I always bring affordable housing in, and Lori always brings affordable housing in, you know, particularly to people that don't understand things like rent stabilization. And, you know, I said to a researcher from Georgia who had all the answers for New York, and I'm like, what about rent stabilization? And he said, well, just repeal it. I was like, oh, okay, that's a really good thing to do. I'll set that up on you, and you get it done.
You know, I just want to mention really quickly, Alex, I'm glad you pointed this out. We need to think about the insurance equation. And Andy, I would recommend another session at some point on this. The insurance costs are skyrocketing for affordable housing. There are communities in this country, you cannot even get insurance. In the Gulf, you cannot get an insurance policy extended, and insurance is only getting more volatile, which means if we can't figure out how to reduce our risk, we're going to be leaning more and more on insurance. We're working right now with Munich Re to say, if we do this in the resiliency space, will you give us a premium reduction? And that's the conversation we're having right now, to say, can the insurance rebate or any kind of reduction be an ROI? That actually appeals to building owners more than anything else that I've spoken about in the last couple of years. Insurance
When
as an ROI.
When I launched the Resilient Design Institute, you know, I thought that the insurance industry was going to be all over this, and, you know, they would start rolling out money toward this new nonprofit 10 years ago. You know, that didn't happen. And what I've learned about the insurance industry is that they're really good at something, and that something is shedding risk. And, you know, when they see that the risk is, you know, too high, like in Florida, they say, we're out of here. And, you know, the state of Florida sort of guarantees, you know, most flood insurance now in the state. And the next big Hurricane Andrew that hits Florida is going to bankrupt the state.
Yep.
You know, it's really
as it would of our country with the NFIP.
Yeah. We have someone asking about like looking at mortgages in the flood zone. Have we delved into that yet?
I think that's kind of what I was saying before, that you know, when you refinance the debt on a building, your mortgage should be the mechanism for making your building more resilient.
Right.
And it's difficult to do. And the missing link on this is neither bankers nor appraisers understand this. And if you talk to a room full of appraisers, they will tell you what's good about a house and what isn't good about a house. And it's the kitchen and it's the bathrooms, but it's not the resilience and it's not the energy efficiency. And very few people bring it up. Where I really have been having fun this evening, but we're at the break point. So I'm going to ask everybody to give like a closing comment. And I'm sure that Harris has something to tell us all. Alex and Lori, you have 1 minute each. Go.
Well, it's been great doing this. Thank you for organizing it, Harris and Andy. You know, I wish we could talk about all these issues. Any one of these topics could have taken an hour. And it's great connecting with Lori again after, you know, working with her on a couple of projects at Enterprise. You know, I guess I'll leave you with what I started with, that, you know, in enhancing resilience, we should look for the win-win solutions. And a really important one is energy efficiency, where we can, you know, save the building owners or building occupants a lot of money, operating energy costs, and at the same time achieve, you know, this habitability goal in those buildings during power outages. So, you know, it's kind of a low-hanging fruit. It's an opportunity to bounce forward from disturbance, to use, you know, these events that are going to become more and more frequent as motivations to implement changes in our building codes, in our permitting process, in our insurance practices, in our mortgage lending, and, you know, through all of that, you know, push for higher levels of energy performance.
Lori.
I would just close by saying, you know, now that you've heard our stories, what we've had to share, please become the ambassadors for this work. And in your communities, as you work in the built environment, as you walk through your streets, pay attention to the infrastructure around you and try to figure out where we can innovate and how you can represent this in your work. We need you because we don't have enough of us, and we're really just beginning. The climate change risks are ever present, and our city depends on all of us to keep this alive and stay courageous. So thank you, Andy. Thank you, Ariel and Green Home. Alex, it's always a pleasure to see you. Reach out if you have more questions or want to talk.
Thank you so much, Lori and Alex. Yeah, keep going in.
And I'd like to say that this was only made possible because of Green Home NYC, which has been around at least 15 years and is all volunteer. And we need more volunteers like Ariel and Harris and actually myself to help put together things like this and get some of the experts from around the country, not just New York City, to talk about what's going on with sustainability and greening everything and how we can fix it. There's always great sessions at Green Home NYC. I'm always blown away by the quality of them, as I was tonight. Thanks, Alex and Lori. And Alex, the next time you're in the city, we'll have those pints of Guinness with the little shamrock in the top of them, because I know places that know how to do it.
Good, I'm ready.
Quick little plug for everyone still online. Please follow us at greenhomenyc.org for our newsletter. We're also on all social media platforms. And as Andy said, we're always looking for volunteers. If there's anyone else with lingering questions, feel free to stick around and we can continue this conversation. I'm sure Lori, Alex, Andy would love that.
Thanks,
Thank
Ariel.
you so much, everyone.
All right, guys.
Bye-bye.